They say some pain is invisible. They don't leave scars, they don't show up in exams, and often they aren't even understood by those who feel it. But they exist. They are there, hidden behind automatic smiles, commitments fulfilled on autopilot, and sleepless nights that no one sees. These pains, silent and constant, corrode from within and often find the place where they decide to manifest themselves in the body. This is exactly what a man wrote about more than 2,000 years ago. His words were not a psalm of victory nor a poem of gratitude. They were a raw outburst, a scream suffocated from within, a confession that spanned centuries without losing its urgency. In the text, he does not ask for riches, does not call for justice against enemies, nor does he mention the names of kings or nations. All he wants is to breathe. Just that. A relief from the crushing weight that sinks you. But we are not facing a fictional character or an allegory. We are facing a real man whose words reveal more than suffering. They reveal a body in ruins because of a sick soul. His account does not begin with explanations or justifications. He simply bows down to something bigger than himself and exposes, without filters, the state he finds himself in. The sentences do not follow an ordered logic. They pulse like someone speaking between sobs. He says that there is no sound part in his flesh, that his bones ache, and that his soul is deeply troubled. These are the words of someone who is trying to describe something that cannot be put into words. And it is exactly this desperate attempt that gives strength to the text. It's not just about physical pain. There is guilt, there is shame, there is awareness that the wounds that now bleed on the body actually began much earlier, in wrong decisions, in prolonged silences, in stifled regrets. In many moments, we have the impression that he is in front of a mirror, looking at each flaw as if it were a scar. And there is no more disguise. Everything that was hidden now weighs heavily. Everything that was ignored now charges. He says that his sins go beyond his head and that they drown him like an unbearable load. It's interesting to note that he doesn't blame anyone. He does not rebel against God, nor does he try to transfer responsibility for what he is feeling. On the contrary, he recognizes his own role in his suffering. This does not exempt him from pain, but it gives him an unexpected dignity, that of someone who refuses to pretend that everything is okay. Modern theology is often quick to offer quick solutions to deep pain. Use verses as bandages when what a person needs is someone to simply sit next to them and listen. Psalm 38 does not offer ready-made answers. It does not try to explain the reason for the pain or promise immediate relief. He just honestly describes what many don't have the courage to say, that sometimes pain paralyzes us, humiliates us, isolates us, and makes us question even our own faith. And it is precisely because there are no answers that this psalm is so powerful, because it validates suffering without having to resolve it, because he gives a voice to those who no longer have the strength to speak. The author does not hide behind formulas. He appears broken, aware that his body is paying a price for internal wounds that have never been treated. And perhaps that's why this psalm is so ignored. It does not fit into faith speeches that promise immediate victory. It doesn't fit with the messages that claim that everything will work out if we simply believe more. He is the opposite of that. It is the record of someone who believed but still fell ill, who prayed but still found himself overwhelmed by guilt and pain. Nowadays, when more and more people are facing anxiety attacks, stress spikes, depression, and emotional exhaustion, the words of this ancient psalm echo with an almost frightening relevance. There are studies that prove the link between emotional state and physical symptoms. There are experts who claim that psychic pain, when ignored, finds ways to lodge in the body. It inflames muscles, changes heartbeat, disrupts sleep, and weakens the immune system. And isn't that exactly what the psalmist is saying, in other words? What this man experienced centuries before Christ is what millions experience now. But unlike many, he did not remain silent. He wrote, He registered. He let his pain become text, not to shock, but to remind us that the soul gets sick. And when this happens, the body follows. Pain that previously seemed abstract takes shape. The psalmist begins to describe his body as a battlefield. There are open wounds, there are inflammations, there is a weight that bends your bones, and there is a discomfort that doesn't let up. And all of this is described with such intensity that reading becomes almost uncomfortable. He says that his flesh stinks because of the wounds, that his loins are inflamed, and that his back is crooked. It's as if every part of the body is screaming at the same time. But these are not just medical descriptions. They are images of someone whose soul overflowed with suffering, and this overflow reached the nerves, the muscles, and the bones. The psalmist's body is the translation of an overburdened heart. He is hunched over, dejected, without energy, and completely exhausted. It is curious to observe how he does not try to separate the physical from the spiritual. For him, everything is connected. Guilt isn't just a feeling, it's a real burden. Sin is not just a transgression, it is a disease that takes over the body. He doesn't compartmentalize his pain. It doesn't say your mind is fine, but your body is weak. He understands that everything is part of the same structure. The soul, when burdened, pulls the body along with it, and the body, when weakened, further aggravates internal conflicts. It is a cycle that feeds on the imbalance itself. In modern times, this type of reading may seem strange. We have become accustomed to separating mind, body, and spirit as if they were independent areas, each treated by a different specialist. But the psalmist, even without the technical terms of contemporary psychology or medicine, perceived this interdependence with an astonishing sensitivity. He didn't need diagnoses to know that something inside him was slowly killing everything outside. And your courage lies in not hiding it. He doesn't try to keep up appearances. It does not try to sustain a facade of spirituality. He admits he is weak, he is exhausted, and he is dirty inside and out. It is common to hear that faith is strength, that believing is synonymous with overcoming. But here we see a man who believes, and yet he is in pieces. And that wounded faith doesn't make you any less worthy. On the contrary, it humanizes him. His faith is not based on achievements, but on persistence. Persistence in speaking, in continuing to seek, even when everything seems meaningless. His body no longer responds like it used to. His eyes have lost their sparkle, and his friends have moved away. But he's still there, saying all of this out loud, or maybe just whispering what little he has left. Many would say that the text is too heavy, that it is not edifying. But perhaps that is precisely why it is necessary. Because there are times when pain needs to be named, when the body needs to say what the soul can no longer sustain alone. And in this psalm, what we see is someone who allowed himself to completely fall apart, not just to be healed, but to be true. The path to any restoration begins with honesty, and he doesn't mince words. He recognizes himself as fragile, as flawed, as someone whose life has lost its axis. Your pain is not just physical, they are existential. He lost the rhythm of life. He lost himself. This pain is not born by chance. The text is clear in showing that your choices had consequences. He does not look for an external culprit. On the contrary, he recognizes that he is reaping what he sowed. But this awareness does not leave him cold. She tears him apart. And it is in this shattering that he begins to rebuild himself. It's as if each sentence were a brick being pulled from a wall he built over the years, a wall that separated him from himself, from others, and from God. Now that wall is starting to crumble, and instead of bricks, there are wounds. There are wounds that have not healed because they were ignored for too long. Throughout history, this type of reporting has often been silenced. In many religious contexts, pain is seen as a lack of faith, illness as an absence of holiness. But the psalmist does not seem concerned with labels. He wants to be seen, want to be heard. He wants to be remembered by God. There is a phrase that runs through the entire psalm, even when it is not said literally, "Forget me not." Because this is perhaps the greatest pain of those who suffer, the fear of being left behind, of being ignored, of screaming and not hearing an answer. The psalmist is surrounded by pain, but what consumes him is the silence that comes from above. This silence, however, does not silence him. He keeps talking, keep exposing. It continues to exist. And in this simple act of continuing, even without guarantees, there is a form of faith that few recognize. It is not the faith of miracles, but the faith of short breath. The faith that does not raise the dead, but that sustains those who are still breathing, even if for a short time. Faith that bleeds, but still prays. Who doesn't understand, but insists. Among the rubble that the psalmist describes, a deeper layer begins to reveal itself. It's not just the body that's hurt anymore. There is something even denser, something that accumulates in the silence and ferments within, emotional repression. He says he is quiet, that he doesn't dare open his mouth, that he swallows his words so as not to make what is already unbearable worse. And this is where the pain takes on a new shape. The pain of not being able to say, of not allowing yourself to feel fully, of fearing that vulnerability itself will further alienate those who are already far away. Silence, which for many is a refuge, is a prison for him. Each choked word is a spark that fuels the fire inside your chest. And as he falls silent, the psalmist bows even more. Repression does not offer you control, but internal lack of control. He tries to hold back what he feels, but his body speaks in a way that he can't contain. The psalm doesn't detail what he meant, but it's easy to imagine. Maybe it was a confession, a request for forgiveness, or just a cry for help. The content doesn't matter. The fact matters. He can't speak. And by not talking, you get even sicker. This scene has deep echoes in the lives of many. The fear of appearing weak, of being judged, and of being abandoned for telling the truth leads many people to wear masks. And these masks, no matter how well designed, do not protect against what happens inside. Holding too much, pretending too much, carrying it alone, all of this has a cost. And the psalmist seems to have learned this too late. Your body now bears the marks of what your mouth shut up. His bones, which were supposed to support him, become witnesses to the weight that was never shared. If you've been following this far and this content makes sense to you, write Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you're together on this journey and help spread the message to more people. There is also another element that makes your pain more intense: isolation. He reports that his friends have moved away, that his relatives avoid him, and that there is no one around to welcome him. The loneliness of the sick, especially when the illness is not visible, is one of the cruelest experiences anyone can live. And he is there, feeling that not only has his body betrayed him, but also the people he once trusted. He is alone. And in this solitude, silence becomes a companion, not by choice, but by abandonment. It is in this environment that pride shows its most destructive face. Not the pride of thinking oneself superior, but the pride that prevents the cry. The pride that says, "I can handle it," when there is no more strength. The psalmist, for a while, tried to be too strong, and this attempt at force destroyed him even more. When he decides to remain silent, he may believe that he is protecting others from his pain. Or maybe you're just trying to maintain some dignity in the face of chaos. But the result is the opposite. When silent, he sinks. When hiding, he falls apart. This kind of pride is subtle. It is dressed in responsibility, maturity, and control. But deep down, it's just fear. Fear of being rejected, of being forgotten, of becoming a burden to others. And the psalmist now feels this weight doubled, the weight of pain and the weight of having hidden it for so long. When he finally admits that there is no more healthy part of his flesh, he is not just describing physical symptoms. He is recognizing that his silence has consumed him from within. That which he believed he was controlling, in fact, completely dominated him. The curious thing is that, even in this state, he continues to believe that someone is listening. Even if he doesn't see an answer, even if the sky is silent, he continues directing his words to God. It is a faith that makes no noise but refuses to die. A faith that does not need an audience, applause, or promises fulfilled. It is the faith of someone who has lost everything except the hope of being heard. The psalmist knows that if he remains silent, he will not resist. And so, even if slowly, he begins to open his soul. And this openness is more than a spiritual gesture. It is a therapeutic step. A healing movement that begins with acknowledging the pain, followed by the courage to name it. Current science has explored in depth the impact of emotional silence on health. Studies show that people who do not express their emotions are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, immune disorders, and hormonal imbalances. The body feels what the soul represses, and spirituality, far from being a denial of pain, can be a bridge to elaborate it, understand it, and transform it. The psalmist, even without access to any of this research, intuits this truth with surprising precision. He realizes that as long as he remains silent, the pain will find no way out. And as long as you insist on appearing whole, you will continue to be broken. In this process, there is something quietly heroic, because admitting weakness, when everything around requires strength, is an act of courage. And that's what he's doing. With each sentence, with each recorded word, he exposes himself a little more. And the more you expose yourself, the more human you become. And the more human, the closer to healing. The soul can no longer hide. After being silent for so long, the psalmist turns completely to the one who, even in silence, is still his only hope. There are no more calculated words, no more attempts to maintain posture. There is just a clamor devoid of any pride, a request for help that does not require explanations, just acceptance. He says, "Lord, all my desire is before you, and my groaning is not hidden from you." It's as if he said, "I can no longer hide what I can't say." The groaning, that which is pre-word, is already known by God. This moment marks a subtle but profound turning point. He's still sick, he's still alone, and he still feels weak. But now speak. Now open it. Now allow your interior to find an outlet. Prayer is neither memorized nor organized. It comes out like a scream held back for too long. And this cry has a name: vulnerability. He doesn't ask for blessings, does not require release. He just gives himself away, as someone who has nothing left to offer other than their own brokenness. And this gesture, as simple as it may seem, carries immense weight, because it is at that moment that pain stops being a solitary burden and begins to be shared with the divine. Prayer here is not a speech. It is not meant to be heard by crowds. There are no beautiful phrases, no bold promises. It's an intimate conversation between someone who has emptied themselves of everything and someone who still has a modicum of trust left. And that minimum, in this context, is everything. He doesn't need to shout to be heard, because what it offers is more than volume. It's true. And the truth, when spoken without disguise, has a force of its own, a strength that does not depend on the body, health, or spirit, a strength that is born from the absolute sincerity of someone who has lost the fear of appearing fragile. It is interesting to see how this type of prayer contrasts with so many religious expressions that require posture, strength, and unshakable conviction. Here, there is none of that. The psalmist is not convinced that he will be healed. He's not sure he'll make it out alive. Don't make declarations of victory. He just gives himself away. And in this delivery lies your greatest strength, because he is no longer fighting against his inner self. He finally stopped resisting himself. And that changes everything. The body is still sick, the soul is still tired, but now there is room for something new. a space opened by the simple act of stopping pretending. This posture is similar to what many therapists call a moment of emotional surrender. This is when a person stops fighting what they feel and begins to accept what is alive within them, even if it is pain. This is not about resignation, but about awareness. The psalmist, when praying like this, is not giving up on life. You are allowing life to reach you again, even if everything is still falling apart inside. He understands that he doesn't need to have all the answers to talk to God, that the value of your prayer is not in its strength, but in its honesty. This moment, although deeply intimate, also reveals a universal trait of the human experience: the search for meaning in the midst of chaos. When everything is falling apart, the spiritual survival instinct leads the heart to cry out, even if the mind doubts. And it is in this abyss that some of the most sincere prayers are born. Not those that repeat formulas, but those that burst into tears. Those that do not ask for explanations, but for presence. Those that do not require healing, but comfort. And this is what the psalmist begins to experience. Not an immediate resolution, but a kind of encounter. This is not a visible encounter. There are no reports of miracles or supernatural manifestations. There is just the recognition that, despite everything, he is not alone. The one he addresses is still listening. You still know every moan, and that, for now, is enough. Prayer here is resistance. It's a thread that keeps you from losing yourself completely. It's what anchors you to life when everything else has fallen apart. And this thread, even if tenuous, is stronger than it seems. In a world that idolizes quick responses and immediate solutions, this kind of spirituality seems fragile. But maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe this faith that bleeds, that creeps, that just whispers, is the truest. Because it does not depend on circumstances or guarantees. It is born in the dark and flourishes without applause. And the psalmist, when praying like this, reminds us that healing often does not begin with the end of pain, but with the ability to continue talking even when everything still hurts. Modern science increasingly recognizes the benefits of authentic spirituality on emotional health. This is not about institutional religiosity, but about a sincere connection with the transcendent. Research indicates that people who maintain this type of bond, even in the midst of suffering, develop greater resilience, face challenges better, and have a more stable sense of purpose. What the psalmist is doing, therefore, is not just an act of faith. It is also a gesture of emotional survival. He is not trying to manipulate God or negotiate his healing. It's just saying, I'm here with all that I am, and that's all I have. And that, oddly enough, is more than enough. The prayer continues, but the scenario does not change. The pain still presses, the weakness still dominates, and the silence of God remains. There is no answer. There is no visible change. The psalmist opens his heart, but he does not receive signs or words from above. He remains alone. And it is at this point that something even more sensitive emerges: the experience of abandonment. Not just the abandonment of people, but the feeling of having been left by God himself. The psalmist begins to describe his enemies. He talks about the traps they set, about those who rejoice in his fall, but his focus is not on them. What really consumes him is the fact that he feels invisible to the sky. This feeling is more common than you might think. When pain lasts, when suffering drags on for days, weeks, or years, it is natural for the soul to ask itself, why didn't relief come? Why didn't help come? Did God hear me? And if you heard, why didn't you respond? These are questions that theology tries to get around with formulas, but that experience insists on shouting. The psalmist does not try to cover up these feelings with positive statements. He admits them. He clearly says that he feels surrounded by those who wish him harm and that his feet are no longer firm. What makes this passage so profound is the contradiction it carries. On the one hand, he believes. on the other hand, doubt it. He talks to God, but he doesn't feel like he's being heard. He continues praying but sees no results. And still, he doesn't give up. His prayer now is marked by painful waiting, by an almost stubborn persistence. He is not there because he received a sign, but because he decided to remain. This abiding, even in silence, is a rare kind of faith. It is faith that is maintained without any visible support, a faith that does not flourish in the miracle, but in its absence. The psalmist even says that he is about to fall, that your pains are always before him, that there is no truce, that your heart beats with restlessness and your vigor has dried up. And through it all, he keeps turning to God. She still calls him Lord. He still says, "It is for you that I wait." This waiting is not passive. It is full of internal struggle. Each verse seems like an effort to stay standing, or at least to not give up completely. The pain continues, the body weakens, but the soul, even torn, insists on searching for some meaning. The lack of response does not keep him away. Suffering does not turn you into someone bitter or blasphemous. He does not deny God, even when he feels he has been forgotten. This tension between the pain that does not go away and the faith that does not die is perhaps one of the greatest expressions of spiritual maturity. Because it does not depend on rewards or guarantees. It just depends on the decision not to let go of the divine hand, even when everything around says it is not there. At this point, the psalmist seems to understand that God's silence is not the end of the story, that the fact of not receiving answers does not mean that your words fell into emptiness. He doesn't try to force an interpretation. It does not create justifications for silence. He just follows. Talk, wait, continue. It is a type of perseverance that transcends understanding, and that, in itself, is healing. Not the healing of the body, but a more subtle healing, that of those who have learned to remain even without seeing. In the modern world, where everything is immediate and where return is required for every effort, this type of attitude seems impractical. But it is precisely in this contrast that it becomes relevant. Waiting for something that cannot be seen, continuing to trust without guarantees, resisting even without a sign of victory, all of this defies the logic of the present time. And at the same time, it reveals a strength that few know about, the strength of those who learn to endure, that of someone who found meaning not in the answers, but in the very act of continuing to ask. The psalmist does not ignore reality. He knows that his enemies are gaining strength, that his health is deteriorating, and that his body no longer reacts as it used to. He knows that, in everyone's eyes, he is losing. But even so, he decides to trust. Not because everything will get better, he's not sure, but because, even if everything gets worse, he knows that there is something greater than the pain. And that's enough to keep him standing, or at least kneeling. This surrender, which requires no return, is one of the purest forms of faith. And she doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need recognition or applause. It is a faith that reveals itself in the dark, that grows in silence, that matures in solitude. The faith that the psalmist describes here is not taught in manuals. It is born from pain that has no name and from waiting that has no deadline. And perhaps it is exactly this faith that transforms, even if no one sees it, even if there are no signs, miracles, or proof. A faith that, even without relief, finds purpose in continuing. There is no miraculous turnaround, no sudden change of scenery. The psalmist ends his prayer with a cry for closeness. He does not ask for healing, nor victory, nor deliverance. He asks for presence. He says, "Do not forsake me, Lord. My God, do not depart from me." These are simple words, but loaded with urgency. What he wants now is no longer for the pain to go away, but for it not to be faced alone. All he needs is to know he wasn't left behind. At this point, suffering is no longer the center of the text. The search now is for relationships. for relief that comes, perhaps, not from solving problems, but from the certainty that there is someone with him in the darkness. The psalmist understands that his greatest need is not the absence of pain, but the presence of God. And it is in this desire that your soul finds rest. A rest that does not depend on circumstances, but on communion. This awareness marks a point of spiritual maturity that few reach. He doesn't deny the pain, nor does he pretend it's over. But you still choose to trust. It is a choice that is not born from promises kept, but from the decision not to let the soul become bitter. He ends the psalm by asking for help. Not a help that eliminates everything that hurts him, but a help that sustains him as he faces each part of what still hurts him. This is where the text transforms, not because of what happens outside, but because of what reveals itself inside. The psalmist is in ruins, but he is not the same as before. There is a difference between who starts the psalm and who finishes it. The first speaks of pain as something unbearable. The second still feels the pain, but now knows where to put it. The first tries to bear everything alone. The second understands that enduring alone is an illusion that makes you sick. The first wants relief. The second wants presence. And this change, however subtle it may be, is profound. He is still surrounded by opponents. He still feels his body failing, and he is still aware of the wrong choices that led him to that state. But now he is shamelessly vulnerable. It is exposed without fear. It's fragile without fault. This is not just spiritual progress, it is a human advancement, because there is something healing about allowing yourself to be whole before God, and being whole includes the cracks. Faith tradition often taught that God's presence manifested itself in strength, in healing, and in extraordinary signs. But in this psalm, the divine presence insinuates itself precisely in the silence, in the waiting, in the restrained crying. Not as a burst of glory, but as a sustaining whisper. The absence of answers becomes space for another type of listening. And the psalmist, in the end, is no longer asking for proof. He's asking for company. This is more than a change of prayer. It is a transformation of being itself. Contemporary medicine has talked about the importance of connection in healing. Not just medicines, but bonds. The touch, the look, the empathy, the welcome. It is these gestures that often work as medicine where science no longer reaches. And spirituality can be one of those deep connections when it does not become empty ritual, but living dialogue. The psalmist shows us this without formulas. He teaches us that being before God, even without beautiful words, even without answers, is a way of not succumbing. It's the thread that holds you together when everything else falls apart. In the end, what we see is not a recorded miracle, but a soul that has learned to be true. And that, in itself, is a form of healing. A cure that is not measured by visible results, but by what begins to reorganize internally. The psalmist does not deny chaos, he just chooses to trust in the middle of it. And this choice, even in silence, even without guarantees, is an act of profound courage. When he says, "Hasten to my aid," he is not demanding God, nor is he giving orders to heaven. It is just revealing its last strength, hope. And this hope, even when everything around remains dark, is a flame that is enough to prevent darkness from winning completely. He does not say, "I have already been healed." He just says, "Come with me." Because sometimes the greatest cure is not to stop suffering, but to have someone to suffer with. It's not about leaving the valley, but knowing that you're not walking alone in it. Thus, the psalm ends without applause, without celebrations, without answers, but with a more lively soul than at the beginning. Not because everything passed, but because someone remained. And in this remaining, even in silence, even in pain, there is a type of miracle that cannot be seen with the eyes, but that transforms everything inside. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If this content made sense to you and helped you see Psalm 38 with new eyes, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we seek to understand the Bible without rushing, with respect for the text and space for reflection. Also, take the opportunity to leave a like. This helps the channel reach more people who may be looking for exactly this type of conversation. And when you finish here, set aside some time to watch the next video. It will follow the same line, deep, direct, and with themes that don't always receive the attention they deserve. See you there.